6 years ago this spring, Grant Ellison sold a $218,000 electric supercar for a beat-up sedan and $1,200 cash, and he'll tell you plain, to this day, hand on his heart, it was the best trade he ever made in his life. I'm Grandpa Ben, folks, and this here's his story. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, because this one's got some layers to it. Now, Grant was 34 years old at the time, a vice president at a big software company out west, pulling down the kind of salary that gets printed in magazine profiles about young talent to watch. The guy was, by every measure this country likes to use, killing it. He'd bought that supercar the same year he'd been promoted to VP, walked into the showroom on a Saturday morning in a golf shirt, test drove it once around the block, and signed the paperwork before lunch. Didn't haggle. Didn't sleep on it. The whole purchase felt less like a decision and more like something that was simply owed to him, given how hard he'd worked to get where he was. That's the American way sometimes, isn't it? You climb the ladder. You figure you're entitled to the view. And for about a year, folks, that car did exactly what it hoped it would do. Turned heads in the office parking garage. Got him invited into a car club he'd been trying to get into for years. The kind of club where grown men stand around a hood on a Saturday morning talking talk numbers like it's scripture. Made him feel, every single time he eased it out of his driveway, like a man who'd finally arrived somewhere important. His neighbors noticed. His co-workers noticed. Even his own mama, who never cared much for flash, said, well, look at you the first time she saw it, and Grant near about floated for a week off that comment alone. But here's the thing about arriving somewhere, folks. Once you're there, you got to actually live there. And that's where the wheels started coming off, if you'll pardon the pun. About 14 months after he bought it, Grant found himself sitting in that car in his own driveway at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the car still powered on, quiet as a held breath the way those electric ones are, having just gotten home from another 12-hour day. And he realized sitting there that he could not for the life of him remember the last time he'd actually enjoyed driving it, not enjoyed showing it off, enjoyed driving it. Realized sitting there in leather that still smelled new after 14 months, that the car had become one more thing on a list of obligations. Something to maintain, something to insure, something to worry over in a parking lot at the grocery store, praying nobody's shopping cart got away from them. Something to show off to people he didn't much like, at parties he didn't much want to go to. He turned the car off and just sat there in the dark a long while, motor silent, feeling something he didn't have a name for yet. If you've ever sat in your own driveway, not ready to go inside, you know exactly the feeling I'm talking about. Now here's a funny thing about how life works, folks. What Grant didn't know that Tuesday night was that 3 streets over, behind the apartment building where his assistant lived, there was a community garden that had gone mostly to weeds. The woman who'd run that plot for 15 years had passed the winter before, and nobody had stepped up to take on her old ground. Grant's assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, mentioned it in passing one afternoon, half a joke, said the whole thing was falling apart, and somebody ought to do something about it before the city came and paved it into more parking. Grant didn't think much of the comment at the time, just kind of nodded, went back to his spreadsheets. But it sat in him. The way things do sometimes. Waiting for the right moment to tap him on the shoulder. About 2 months after that driveway night, on something close to impulse. The kind of impulse that sneaks up on a man who's been running on autopilot too long. Grant drove over after work and looked at the plot. 6 feet by 8 feet. Mostly weeds, knee-high in places. One rusted padlock on a gate that hadn't been oiled in years, seized up solid. A cracked wheelbarrow tipped over in the corner, half full of rainwater and old leaves. He stood there a long while, still in his work suit, dress shoes getting flat out ruined in the mud, and he felt something close to the opposite of what he usually felt standing next to that supercar of his. He felt small. Small in a way that was uncomfortable, sure, but also somehow a relief. Like setting down a bag you didn't realize you'd been carrying. Priya put him in touch with the woman who managed the garden association, and by that Friday, the abandoned plot was officially his to work. He listed the supercar that same week, and within days a collector 2 states over made him an offer. No fancy negotiation. No back and forth, traded it straight up for a beat-up sedan that got him to work just fine, plus $1,200 cash to boot. No hard feelings on either side, the collector thought he'd robbed the man blind, and honestly, by the numbers, he kind of had. Grant didn't care. Took over the garden plot the following Saturday morning, coffee in one hand, a brand new pair of work gloves in the other, feeling like a man starting something instead of maintaining something. Well, his friends thought he'd plumb lost his mind. Plain and simple. A man who'd worked his whole career toward exactly the kind of success that car represented, turning around and trading it in for a patch of dirt behind somebody's apartment complex. Most folks in his circle figured it was some kind of breakdown, or a strange midlife crisis come about a decade early. One friend in particular, a fella named Reggie, who'd been in that same car club with him, elbow to elbow at every Saturday meet-up for years, told him outright over drinks one night that he was throwing away everything he'd built to play in the mud like a kid. Said it kind of sharp, kind of embarrassed for him, if we're being honest. And the two of them didn't talk much for a good while after that conversation. That's how it goes sometimes, folks. You make a change that's right for you, and it can rattle the folks around you who built their whole identity next to the old version of who you were. Now, the first few weeks on that plot were nothing. And I mean nothing, like Grant expected. He'd figured, in some vague, romantic sort of way, that gardening would feel peaceful right out the gate. Turned out, it mostly felt like hard. Dirty, frustrating work that gave him almost nothing back for a good long while. He killed his first 3 attempts at tomatoes outright. Didn't know the soil needed testing. Didn't know the difference between a weed and a seedling half the time. Pulled up a whole row of squash sprouts, thinking they were nuisance growth. Spent an entire Saturday afternoon on his knees, hands blistered raw, genuinely. Honestly furious at a patch of dirt for not doing what he wanted it to do. A feeling that struck him as almost funny later on, seeing as how he'd never once been angry at that supercar for anything. Not even the 2 times it left him stranded needing a tow. He almost quit. Told Priya as much on a Monday, said maybe this whole thing was a mistake. Maybe Reggie had a point after all. But about 6 weeks in, right about the time he was ready to call the whole experiment foolish and let the plot go back to weeds, Grant got his first real payoff. One single heirloom tomato. Not much bigger than a golf ball, kind of lopsided, a little scarred up on one side, but his. Grown from an actual seed, with his own 2 hands, in dirt he'd fought with for a month and a half straight. He ate it standing right there in the plot, dirt still packed under his fingernails, juice running down his wrist, and he told folks afterward, and he still tells folks this today, that it was the best thing he had ever tasted in his entire life. Better than any steak dinner he'd ever driven that car to. Now it was right around that same time Reggie came by, more out of curiosity than support. Mind you, the man wanted to see, with his own 2 eyes, what Grant had given up that $218,000 car for. This little patch of dirt. Stood there at the gate in his pressed weekend clothes, looked over the whole modest little setup. Some tomatoes, a row of beans climbing a busted trellis, a stubborn patch of squash that hadn't quite figured out what it was doing with itself yet, and asked Grant, half serious, half still a little annoyed, whether he actually truly thought this whole thing was worth it. Grant thought on that a good minute before he answered. Told Reggie the car had given him exactly one thing worth having, a feeling of arrival. For about a year. That faded the second the next model year came out, and somebody else's ride looked shinier and newer parked next to his in that same garage. The garden, 6 weeks in, dirt poor and half failed as it still was at that point, had given him something the car never once managed to give him. The real, hands-in-the-dirt feeling of watching something exist because he'd made it exist. Slow and unglamorous, and entirely his own. Nobody could outspec him on a tomato. Nobody could roll up next to him in the produce aisle with a nicer one. Told Reggie straight up, the car was status. The garden was proof he could grow something real. Reggie didn't have much to say to that, not right away. Man just kind of nodded, looked at his shoes, and left. Didn't come back that week, or the next. But about 2 months later, doggone if he didn't show up at that gate again. Quieter this time, hat in his hands almost, and asked Grant if he knew whether there was another plot available. Said his own life had been feeling a whole lot more like a showroom lately than he cared to admit out loud, and he figured it was time to try something that couldn't be repossessed. Grant's still working that plot today, folks, 6 years running now. Expanded some over the years, eventually taking over another section, once the fella 2 rows down retired from gardening entirely. Grows more than he and his family can rightly eat most summers, and gives plenty of it away. Priya still gets the first basket of tomatoes every year, no exceptions, and neighbors and co-workers get whatever's left after that. His kids know their way around a compost pile better than most grown men do. Doesn't own a fancy car anymore and hasn't gone back to it not once, drives the same practical sedan he traded into that first week, and it's got better mileage on the clock now than most cars twice its price ever manage before the transmission gives out. says he doesn't miss the supercar, not one bit, not even the quiet rush of it pulling away from a stoplight, which he used to think, back in the day, he'd miss more than anything else in the world. What Grant learned, kneeling in dirt that first difficult summer, blistered hands and all, was that the car had given him a feeling that depreciated the moment he drove it off the lot, literally, on paper, in dollars and cents, and also in every other way that actually mattered to him deep down. The garden was the flat-out opposite. Every single season, it was worth more to him than the season before. Not because it was worth more money. Lord knows a tomato patch behind an apartment building isn't fetching top dollar at auction, but because more of his own life was stitched into it, one slow, sweaty season at a time. Now maybe you don't have a supercar sitting pretty in your driveway, folks. Maybe your version's a lot smaller than that. Or maybe it's bigger. I don't know your life, but I'd wager good money that most of you watching this right now have got some version of Grant's car. Some fast, shiny thing you've been chasing, hustling for, sacrificing sleep and Saturdays for. Something that gives you a real good feeling right up until about 10 minutes after you finally get it, and then it fades on you. Quiet as anything, and you're already looking around for the next shiny thing to chase. Meanwhile, there's a slower, quieter thing sitting somewhere nearby, a garden, a guitar gathering dust in the closet, a relationship you've been meaning to actually show up for, that would grow into something lasting, something that's really and truly yours if you just give it the time it's asking for. So tell me down in the comments, y'all, what's your patch of dirt? What's the slow thing you've been putting off in favor of the fast thing? I read every one of them, I promise you that. And if this one found you at the right moment tonight, stick around, folks. I've got more stories like it every single week. Take care of yourselves, and take care of that patch of dirt, whatever it turns out to be for you.